Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Functional Medicine for Real World Impact. I'm your host, Tracy Harrison, and today we're going to be talking about the concept of adrenal fatigue, a myth riddled, highly misleading concept to patients and practitioners alike. So many people have been told that they are burnt out, that their adrenals are shot. They feel wired but tired. They feel like they're running on empty. They feel high fatigue. And they've learned or read up themselves to blame their adrenal glands. But the truth is far richer from a functional physiology viewpoint. And today I'm going to be covering 5 key myths about adrenal fatigue and how we can more accurately and helpfully approach stress physiology. First of all, stress isn't inherently harmful. In fact, we need stress in order to survive and even thrive. The problem becomes when the body never receives a signal that the threat has passed. Chronic stress physiology actually lies underneath many of the chronic conditions that we see in our practices today, whether it's insulin resistance or autoimmune disease, immune hypervigilance, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. But in order to help patients truly to heal themselves, we need to understand the physiology driving their dysfunction and not just managing the symptoms. And part of this is certainly challenging persistent myths. I had thought that the myth of adrenal fatigue or adrenal exhaustion had died out a while ago, but I continue to hear about it on a regular basis. The real story is actually more hopeful. Very seldom is the adrenal gland broken or even fatigued. In fact, it's doing exactly what it was designed to do based on the input that it's receiving. And a reframe on our approach to adrenal fatigue and stress can help us to better assess cases, communicate with our patients, and ultimately improve how we support them with interventions. So, first, let's talk a little bit about stress physiology and how the body responds to stress. First of all, it's important to understand that stress ultimately, by and large, is a perception of the body. It's sometimes there is physiologic stress involved that might be poor oxygenation, such as sleep apnea, or maybe a persistent infection, maybe a gut imbalance, or a chronically brewing UTI. These are physiological stressors. Often, though, the most chronic forms of stress that your patients wrestle with are mental, emotional, spiritual, relational, uh, career oriented, financial, right? The types of things that certainly may be present in our lives as imbalances or dissatisfying factors, but our body is really responding to the perceived threat in our mind. There is, of course, a powerful network called the HPATG axis that is enlivening an orchestrated endocrine system in the human body. And in the face of a stress surge or a threat, it is the brain that responds first, the hypothalamus, via activating our sympathetic nervous system. This is what helps us to survive, helps us to run for our lives or to fight or to accomplish major physical feats, helping us to fight, flight, hide, or fawn. And the brain triggers the adrenal medulla. It's a portion of the adrenal glands to release stress hormones, specifically epinephrine and norepinephrine. And this is what you feel can aggressively change our physiology to help us survive. Our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up, our blood sugar goes up. We become alert and hyper vigilant and really quite focused. We may start to assume or estimate or discern what possible or potential threats might be, right? We become hyper vigilant. This first stress response is fast and aggressive, but it does have a short half life. It's our initial acute stress response, but it's not designed for sustained signaling. It's actually the adrenal. Um, it's actually It's actually the other portion of the adrenal gland that responds for an extended stress response over minutes or hours. This is where the adrenal gland is stimulated in the cortex to produce cortisol. And cortisol is important for helping us to weather stress. It helps to sustain energy availability in terms of greater levels of blood sugar. It helps to modulate immune activity. It helps to protect our body from the effects of stress. And we are designed actually to awaken with a good, healthy cortisol surge, what's often called a cortisol awakening response, so that even on a typical normal day, we are jump starting our physiology into functioning optimally. We have baseline levels of cortisol that follow a diurnal rhythm. And then the cortisol levels that we experience over time might be adaptively increasing in anticipation of greater levels of stress. We might experience this if we go through a challenge or a project. It might be positive stress, like planning a wedding or taking on a really challenging project at work. It can also be negative stress, things that are hard to navigate, or simply facts of life. We might be experiencing divorce or grief or extreme disappointment, or maybe a threat, a damaged relationship, a loss of a job, for example. But in general, our HPA axis is designed to orchestrate a combined response from the brain and also from our other organs and glands, led by the actions of cortisol, which are secreted by the adrenal gland. Now, let's jump into five specific myths and opportunities for clarity about stress and stress physiology. First of all, the most important one I mentioned earlier is that stress is not all bad. The belief is that somehow stress is always promoting damage to the body. And so the healthiest lifestyle is avoiding all stress. The reality is that we only thrive via stress. The vast majority of the body's compensatory, protective, or healing mechanisms have to be stimulated. That is, if there's not a demand for an antioxidant, we won't make as much of an antioxidant. We need to undergo what we refer to as hormesis. That is doses of stress or challenge that we can navigate, that we can overcome. Low grade, perhaps frequent stressors that are episodic, from which we can readily control and recover. And the small amount of damage that might be done helps to stimulate greater immune function, helps to stimulate greater tissue healing, helps to stimulate greater inflammation resolution or better metabolism, and also better healing processes, both intracellularly and extracellularly, as well as all sorts of biochemicals, such as a variety of antioxidants. You've undoubtedly heard of things like exercise and intermittent fasting, cold plunges, infrared saunas. All of these ultimately have health promoting effects on the body via the same mechanism, hormesis. But what is hormetic for me might be harmful for you, and vice versa. We have to learn experientially what are types of challenge or stress that we can readily navigate, that are ultimately health and vitality promoting, as opposed to chronic and degrading and ultimately promoting harm. What is hormetic for one might be harmful for another. And this is where one particular type of exercise or one particular fasting regimen is never going to work for everyone. It's critical that as practitioners, we become comfortable customizing our recommendations in order to identify in partnership with each unique patient and client what is good hormesis for them. People who are already undergoing lots of stress, maybe they're recovering from an injury or surgery, are likely not going to find themselves to be resilient in the face of strong stress. And that also includes things like excessive fasting or excessive exercise. But not all stress is bad. It's about finding that magic amount, right, of stress. Even in the mental, emotional arena, right? Good work challenges can be motivating. They can be inspiring and can help to create drive for creativity and rolling up our shirt sleeves and devoting ourselves to a project. But excessive, long standing stress demands that we don't feel we can meet, or demands that we feel are inappropriate or completely beyond our control. These are the types of things that can easily move from hormesis to harm, especially when they're not episodic and they become unrelenting, chronic, and unresolved. The second long-standing myth is that cortisol is bad. And I've already spoken to this, right? That cortisol is somehow a problem, and our goal should be to attain as low a cortisol as possible. For sure, patients who have truly rock bottom, or what we often refer to as flatline cortisol, would tell you that there's very little vitality to be had with rock bottom cortisol. As I said earlier, ultimately, cortisol is a critical hormone that helps us to navigate stress in the body. Cortisol is a powerful anti inflammatory agent. And as I said earlier, it actually helps to orchestrate a response from the body to help us to survive, to help us to thrive on a day in and day out basis. Now, of course, occasional episodic elevated cortisol, like I said, going through a few days or a few weeks of a particular challenge, this is normal life. And it can help us to navigate it, right? With appropriate shifts in things like our blood pressure and our blood sugar and our heart rate and our vigilance. However, when we move from having episodic acute surges in cortisol to having a chronic, unrelenting activation, especially over many weeks and months, or maybe even years, then this is where high levels of cortisol can actually become maladaptive and contribute to a lot of damage and the development of chronic disease in the body. Things such as insulin resistance and immunosuppression, sleep disruption, dysregulation in immune tolerance. All of these can arise because of the chronic, excessive, harmful stress effects. Especially when it is as a result of something upstream that we don't understand. And this is where you, working with a unique patient in order to help them to uncover the most important critical stressors in their life, is a powerful component of your clinical service and support. Sometimes people are aware of the family or work or financial stressors, but often behind the scenes, there are physiological stressors involved that we may need a good partnership with a practitioner in order to understand, so that we can assess and resolve what is at play in our unique lives. But as I said earlier, cortisol is designed to protect us and to help to prime the body's entire endocrine system. We're not only experiencing episodic higher levels of cortisol, we have a healthy diurnal rhythm, including that large first morning cortisol awakening response that helps to prime all of our nuclear receptors for hormones so that we can experience vitality. Ultimately, we want to have surges of cortisol, higher levels when necessary in order to protect us. We just don't want it to become our norm because of the degradation, the catabolic effects that can result. Now, for the third myth, let's dive into adrenal fatigue because there actually is one real diagnosis that fits the physiological description of adrenal fatigue, but it's not what most people mean when they use that phrase. True primary adrenal insufficiency is called Addison's disease. I'm sure you're familiar with it. This is caused by autoimmune and sometimes infectious destruction of the adrenal cortex. This can indeed directly impair the adrenal gland's ability to produce cortisol. This tissue, the adrenal gland, one or both of them, is indeed fatigued or exhausted. It's damaged, usually as a result of inflammation and substantial oxidative uh, stress over time. However, Addison's disease is really quite rare, at least in humans. And instead, what people are often referring to when they talk about adrenal fatigue is when they have lost a good, healthy diurnal rhythm of cortisol. They're not getting that good, healthy morning cortisol awakening response to help jumpstart their organs and glands into functioning optimally, or their overall level of cortisol may be lower, may be suboptimal in the morning. It might actually be suboptimal throughout the day. A normal, healthy cortisol rhythm has that morning awakening response, followed by a slow dropping off during the day and a low level at night that allows us to sleep deeply and for extended periods of time. There's actually a dance between melatonin and cortisol that allows melatonin to surge while cortisol is low so that we can indeed sleep deeply. Yeah, if our cortisol is too high overnight, we tend to sleep lightly, where sleep is easily interrupted. We are less likely to have the good multiple episodes of deep sleep overnight that are especially needed for healing of the brain. And so there are all sorts of changes in actual cortisol levels that can happen over time. But this does not happen because the adrenal gland is worn out or broken or tired. It actually happens because of a dysregulation in the HPA axis system. And lower cortisol levels can indeed lead to people feeling fatigue, malaise, lack of vitality. This makes sense when you consider the powerful role of cortisol in reducing inflammation in the body. So, with lower cortisol, we're more likely to have a higher inflammatory burden. We need cortisol in order to prime receptors for thyroid hormone or for estrogen or testosterone, right? So that we can feel the high vitality, high energy effects of these hormones. When we have lower levels of cortisol, we have less endocrine effects, even if the levels of other hormones in the blood, for example, are seemingly optimal. But ultimately, both really high levels or lower levels of cortisol are both artifacts of extended stress. And it's quite common, although not universal, for continuous, unrelenting stress to drive a person's cortisol levels from being quite high to eventually dropping, often not linearly, but one time of day or another, but progressively leading to lower and lower levels of cortisol. We might refer to this as more of a hypoadrenal state. But ultimately, this is happening for a variety of reasons. First of all, the glucocorticoid receptor, right, that is actually causing cortisol's effects to be realized by the body, can become down regulated, right? Just like with thyroid hormone or estrogen, like I was saying, ultimately the effects are carried out via receptor activation, which involves a lot more physiology than just having good amounts of the hormone itself. uh, we can actually have a down regulation in the sensitivity of those receptors, and that's called glucocorticoid resistance. And this can develop in the face of chronically high free cortisol. In fact, the initial stages of that may happen where people have high levels of cortisol, but they're still feeling high levels of inflammation because the receptor is keeping the cortisol from activating and having cellular effects. Beyond that, however, prolonged stress and inflammation may result from may result in low cortisol because the brain actually recalibrates itself. And we also can see that inflammation itself can suppress the production of cortisol in the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is not broken. In fact, we see it all the time. If the stressor and the inflammation can be reduced at their source, the adrenal gland nearly always bounces back quite readily for more optimal cortisol synthesis. Ultimately, the adrenal gland can protect itself via multiple mechanisms so that it is able to locally regulate the stimulation that is taking place to produce cortisol. And again, this is not a failure, it's actually a protective state. We are designed for the sympathetic nervous system and the body's response to stress to be episodic. The vast majority of natural acute stressors are short lived. You see this all the time in animals in the wild where they may need to run for their lives to keep from being attacked or to keep from being eaten. But as soon as possible, these animals are going to return to a restive state. They often will shake off the stress as a way of recalibrating their balance, right? Their nervous system balance. The challenge is that humans are not very good at shaking off stress. Unfortunately, even when we have stress in a relationship or stress in a job or stress in a project, we tend to not let go of it. And this is the fifth myth and certainly awareness that I want to build is that often chronic stress is less about the stressor still being present and more about us keeping it alive in our minds. Think about it. Even practitioners, we're all human. We have experiences where we undergo a stress and the stressor actually goes away. It ends, or it may fade away. It may be something we can walk away from if we choose, but yet we can easily keep ruminating about it. We keep telling the same story in our head. We keep reliving the insult, the disappointment, the hurt feelings, right? We're keeping it alive. And again, because the brain does not distinguish between what we imagine and what we replay in our minds from reality, we actually have a lot of control over this. But without awareness and without self discipline around choosing to let go of old stories, we can keep playing over and over again our really stressful experiences from the past. This is where a good functional practitioner can help someone to resolve physiological stressors, such as persistent gut dysbiosis, or sleep apnea, or mercury toxicity, or caloric deprivation, right? Inadequate nutrition. These are physiological stressors that, with a good clinical partner, we can resolve. But often, even as those physiological stressors move away, we are keeping alive mental and emotional stress in our minds. And our physiology is still responding to it, still seeing it as a threat. And it is continuing to keep our sympathetic nervous system activated for a prolonged period of time, or maybe activated frequently, more acutely, when our restless mind goes right back to the terrible thing that happened to us, or goes right back to our fear, goes right back to our hurt or our threat. This is where savvy clinical partnerships between patients and clients alike are so powerful to create a sacred space, a platform for honest, vulnerable inventories of our stressors. What are we afraid of? What do we ruminate about? What can we not just let go of? What do we cling to, even if the event, the person, the relationship, the harm, the hurt has passed? Maybe months ago, maybe years ago. For some of your patients, maybe decades ago. But make no mistake, our physiology is still responding to it. And in particular, it's some of these more entrenched and insidious stressors that can be activating our stress response long enough that they do lead to this protective down regulation in the brain and in our adrenal glands that can lead to low cortisol. And the fatigue, the malaise, the heavy limbs, the low energy, the suppression and dysregulation, hypervigilance, autoimmune disease, these types of things that are so often at play with individuals who have lower cortisol levels. In particular, they may sleep a lot, but yet never feel truly rested and rejuvenated the day following. This is where the only way on the other side is to actually go through the inventory, to go through the self awareness and the process of learning to shift our perspective, shift our self talk, and develop durable stress management activities that can help to calm our physiology. This is where seemingly simple patient practices, sustainable lifestyle habits like gratitude journaling, or mindful breathing, where we help to regulate our nervous system to relax into a parasympathetic mode with slow, mindful inhales and exhales through the nose, and especially exhalations that are longer than our inhalations. These all help to communicate to our brain that despite the thoughts we're having, we are indeed safe. We do not need to fight, flight, and hide for survival. We can risk a more parasympathetic dominant nervous system mode. We can risk letting go of fighting, flighting, and hiding and focus on resting, digesting, detoxifying, healing tissue, being fertile, and having babies. The aspects of our daily life experience that we regard as being high vitality. This is something the body will promote only when it is assured of our survival, assured of our safety. And the fifth point here is about making sure that we understand that we don't hide the real state of our stress from our own nervous system. And sometimes the most relentless chronic source of stress is actually that voice in our head that keeps telling stories, keeps worrying about the same fears, the same threats, and living prior stressors. And so these are five powerful perspective shifts on adrenal fatigue that I encourage you to consider and adopt in your practice. Use these principles. I've chosen simple ones today on purpose instead of getting into some of the complicated physiology. These are simple myths and restatements, right? Clarity that you can give your patients, that they can learn to lean on, that their adrenal gland is not this vulnerable tissue that is easily broken and made dysfunctional by their stress. Nothing could be further than the truth. The HPA axis is actually quite strong and resilient and capable of helping us to survive incredibly intense acute stressors. But in the face of chronic stressors, for sure, our physiology is educated, it's adapted to protect itself. And so we can educate, inspire, and empower our patients to better understand that their body is strong. It's not vulnerable, it's not broken. Outside of true autoimmune disease, which is rare in humans, Addison's disease, the adrenal gland is very seldom truly um, fatigued enough to be dysfunctional or broken and exhausted. Instead, the onus stays on us to assess what is at play in our unique lives and understanding the legitimate stressors that we're facing right now and working with a skilled practitioner like you to step by step resolve them, right? We don't have to fix a broken gland. We don't even have to try and optimize a number on a cortisol test, right? Our greatest opportunity is to identify what the body is still registering as a threat, to take action to assure safety, and then to shift our lifestyle habits to promote rest and resiliency. I hope that you and your patients never think about tired adrenals the same way again. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next time.